Catherine Heller. And what are we going to talk about today, Catherine?
Well, you know, as many of you may have, some of you may have seen, we just recently announced that Visual Studio Tools for Office is now adding support for Outlook. So rather than just Word and Excel document-centric solutions, you can now write add-ins for Outlook.
In Visual Studio?
In Visual Studio, in the upcoming release. So this is like right around the corner.
Fantastic. And we can thank Andrew for this wonderful achievement, or what's going on here?
Yes, I've been working on this.
So Andrew Whitechapel is a program manager on the Visual Studio Tools for Office team, and Andrew has been instrumental in making this happen. So Andrew, here in your book, you have a whole section on isolating managed extensions, isolating add-ins, and why it's important that what is VSTO providing on top of it, because today I could use the shared add-ins project in Visual Studio and write an add-in for Outlook. What is VSTO providing in addition to what I had today?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. The reason that we've got add-in support for Outlook is because there is a problem with managed add-ins with Office generally. So you can currently produce managed add-ins. And you can also shim them. And the problem is that by default you don't get a shim. So if you use the Visual Studio shared add-in wizard to produce a managed add-in for Office, you get an add-in but you don't get a shim.
What do you mean by a shim?
Well, the basic problem with the default add-in is that it's not shimmed. And the reason that that's a problem is because by default when you install your add-in, it gets registered against MS Core E. And MS Core E is the bootstrap DLL that loads the .NET runtime. And that means all of your managed add-ins are registered against MS Core E. And there's a number of problems with that. One is that all of your managed add-ins get loaded into the same app domain, the default app domain. That means all of your managed add-ins, all of your managed smart tags, your real-time data components, everything goes in the same app domain. And we know from experience that people in the field that have had problems with this because if you have an add-in that behaves in a non-robust manner, it can affect every other add-in in the same app domain. So if you've got an add-in, for instance, that's doing something like calling release come object in Hadoop aggressively to release its own references and clean itself up, it cleans itself up quite happily, but if it's in the same app domain with other add-ins, then it also actually impacts them and they get cleaned up as well. And so they start behaving very mysteriously.
So that means if I've tested my add-in and I've ensured it worked, it could stop working because someone else installed another add-in by someone else that released my common object.
This is the reports that we get from ISVs and from customers in the field. They say, well, our add-in worked perfectly well for years and years and years, and suddenly we installed this other add-in, and now, although the other add-in works, our add-in is broken, and we don't understand why, and it's doing strange things, and it breaks it in odd places erratically.
Right, and people typically might have more than one add-in in Outlook.
Yeah, and it's not just Outlook, and the principles apply across Office. Obviously, any Office host can host multiple add-ins, and if they're managed add-ins, by default they all go into the same app domain. So that's a big problem, and the standard solution that's out there in the field at the moment is that people use shims to shim their add-in, and we have a download available on MSDN, which is a set of wizards that plug into Visual Studio and let you create a shim for your add-in. And what that does is that it changes the registration so that when you deploy your add-in, what actually gets registered is your add-in shim. And the shim is an unmanaged DLL. So Office loads the shim then loads the add-in. And that gives you a component in the middle that can do other things apart from what the standard behavior is. So the standard behavior is just load the add-in and put it in default domain, and that's it. If you've got a shim in place, the shim can do other things, like it can create a separate app domain, for instance, and load the add-in to the separate app domain. It can do things like checking security constraints on that add-in. It can do anything else you like because it's a separate component.
But you have to write that. Can you write that in managed code, or you'd actually have to write that in native code?
That would have to be written in native code, and this is what the current download on MSDN gives you a wizard which will produce an unmanaged DLL, shim component. So that kind of works. I mean, it does the job. It will put your add-in in a separate app domain, which is the main thing. The disadvantages with that are that firstly, it's not supported. So although it's on MSDN, it's demo. It's not a shipped product. We don't support it. So that's a bit of a problem. Secondly, it does mean that you have to produce one of these shims for every single add-in, every single managed add-in, even though 99.8% of the code or thereabouts is exactly the same across all of your shims. You still have to have a separate shim for each add-in. Plus, it's unmanaged code, and if you're developing managed add-ins, you may not be familiar with the unmanaged code.
Sure. And it's unsafe code.
It's C++, it uses the ATL, and a lot of people have no idea what to do with the ATL or C++. The wizard kind of protects you from a lot of the potential problems in that it will generate stuff for you. So in theory, you shouldn't have to touch the shim code at all. But you might have to touch it. And if you do have to touch it and you don't know anything about the ATL, then you're in a world of hurt.
Right, and so now you have all of these. Now you have all these versions of that shim, the ones that you may have modified, plus all the versions you have for each one of your add-in are now out there in the wild.
Yeah, that's right. It's unsupported. You can change it to do things that we have no idea what you've done. If you don't really understand what the shim is doing, and some of the code in there, because it's essentially bootstrapping the .NET runtime, and some of the code in there is code that you wouldn't normally, the average developer producing applications wouldn't normally go anywhere near. So there's some very hairy code in there. So you can easily go wrong with it. It's difficult to know what to do if you do have to change anything, and it's not supported.
So tell us, what has been included into VSTO Outlook? How is that shim problem being resolved?
The basic component is just a resolution of the shim problem and nothing much more. So we have an existing VSTO runtime that does all sorts of useful infrastructure-like things, like it creates app domains, it checks security policy, it applies the security policy to the app domain, it checks configuration, lots of very useful things which we've been using for VSTO document level customizations for Word and Excel. And so, but the plumbing that the runtime does, is not specific to document level customizations. So we decided that we could reuse this plumbing for application level customizations, for add-ins, effectively. And that's what we've done. And the first host application we're targeting is Outlook. So with Outlook, you can produce a managed add-in which will use the VSTO runtime, which is exactly the same runtime that's used by Word and Excel for document customizations. So there are a number of advantages in that we're reusing the same components. So this is a robust set of components that's been in development for a long time, and it's pretty stable. We know what we're doing in there, and we're just reusing it for application level add-ins.
Cool.
So that's what's let you been able. That's why it's been possible to introduce it so late in the product cycle. I imagine being able to leverage all of that.
Yeah, because we have one additional DLL which kind of bootstraps the VSTO runtime, but this additional DLL it does two things. Firstly, it bootstraps the VSTO runtime, which means there's almost nothing in there, which as you say is why it's so easy to introduce it so late, because it doesn't really do very much. The other thing it does is that it acts as an adapter between the Office host and the VSTO runtime in terms of interface. So the Office host expects to be able to talk to an add-in that implements IDT extensibility too. And the VSTO runtime with document level customizations traditionally expose an interface called iStartup. So we basically map between IDT extensibility 2 and iStartup.
So do my VSTO add-ins have to implement ID extensibility 2, or?
No, when you create a VSTO add-in currently for Outlook in Visual Studio, you'll get a set of code generated for you which implements iStartup, not IDT extensibility 2. So our add-in loader implements IDT extensibility 2 on your behalf. So it's acting like the traditional shim that people were producing, which itself implemented IDT extensibility 2. So it's just that we do it for you, and we have a supported component that does it, and you don't have to build one for every add-in. You just build your add-in. We've already got the shim, so you just use the shim to load your add-in.
So it's a single shim for each COM add-in, or each VSTO add-in that I'm that I deploy?
Yes,
or?
the shim is completely transparent to you. So that the model is that there is actually a shim in that when Office will, when Office loads add-ins, it goes to the registry to find the add-ins that it's supposed to load. What it will actually find is add-in loader, DLL, which is our supported shim. But as part of the registration will be information about your add-in. So Office will attempt to load your add-in, but it will really load add-in loader. Add-in loader will then go off and eventually load your add-in. So there is only, so you don't, the shim is transparent, you don't care about the shim anymore, you just concentrate on the add-in itself. As far as you're concerned, there is no shim. You're not aware that there is one.
So Visual Studio, I'm just going to say new Outlook add-in and write my
That's
code.
right. That's right.
And the story.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Pretty cool. Now, what about security, though? With add-ins in Outlook, aren't there different levels of security that you can set, whether you have to sign your ActiveX, or your add-in, sorry, wrong technology here, whether you sign things, or how does that fit in with the VSTO and code access security model?
Yes, it's with Outlook specifically, there are a number of additional dimensions to security, but for Office in general, Office has long had a traditional macro-based model of security where you have levels of trust. Is it low, medium, high? And that governs whether you get prompted or not and whether add-ins get loaded silently or not. You can also specify whether you want all add-ins on the machine to be trusted or not. With VSTO document customizations, we have a much stricter security policy. And the history of that is that it's to do with the fact that documents can be emailed around, passed around. They don't actually get installed on a machine. The implication is that if you go to the effort of installing some piece of software on a machine, then presumably you trust it or your admin trusts it, otherwise you wouldn't have installed it. Whereas with a document, it can just appear from nowhere. And we don't want the user to have a kind of trust decision every time a document appears in email. Do I trust this or not? So we have a very strict security model with VSTO document customizations. We basically don't trust anything. So if there is code behind a Word document or an Excel workbook, we don't actually trust it. By default, we trust nothing. So you have to have explicit trust somewhere in your code access security policy to say, yes, I do trust this assembly that's associated with this document. And we've done the same with add-ins for Office, for Outlook, in that, again, we don't trust them because they use the same VSTO runtime, and VSTO runtime checks security policy, and it insists that you have explicit trust for that assembly. So we're using exactly the same mechanism, which means that when you deploy your add-in, you also have to deploy code access security for the add-in to say you explicitly trust this thing. And the argument for using full trust security for add-ins is not as strong as it is for documents. In that, as I say, with a document it can get emailed around, so we have to impose stricter security on it. With an add-in, you do have to install it first. So if you have installed it, you've got it in the registry, you presumably trust it already. So the case for using code access security for add-ins is not as strong as it is for documents. But we use it because that's what the VSTO runtime does. We've been consistent with exactly the same model.
The thing though is, isn't there a level of whether of policy in Outlook for add-ins, or maybe it's across Office in general, though, whether your add-ins have to be signed?
Right. Yeah. Sorry, that was part of your earlier question.
Right.
I forgot all about it. Yes. Yes, and this is a problem with MS Core E. So with a managed add-in, by default, it's registered against MS Core E. So Office doesn't really load your add-in, it loads MS Core E, and MS Core E loads your add-in. The problem is MS Core E isn't signed, and it can't be signed. And if you were to sign MS Core E, what you would then be saying is that you fully trust MS Core E. But the thing is, MS Core E is loading all sorts of arbitrary add-ins, and you would then be saying, I trust everything that MS Core E is going to load. And the problem with that is that MS Core E doesn't check anything about the add-in. It just says, I've been told to load this add-in, so I will load it. So if you were to sign MS Core E, trust based on its signature, you would then trust every single managed add-in. So what we've done is that we've got a component, the add-in loader. Architecturally, it performs the same role as MS Core E, in that Office loads our add-in loader, and our add-in loader then loads the add-in. One of the additional things that we do is that we don't blindly load the add-in, we check security. We say, well, we've been told to load this add-in, but we're not automatically going to load it, we're going to go off and check security first. So add-in loader is signed, sign the Microsoft certificate. So you can make a trust decision when you install add-in loader as to whether or not you trust add-in loader. But that doesn't mean to say you're automatically trusting every add-in, because you still have to have explicit CAS policy to trust every individual add-in. So it's on a per add-in basis. The only difference is that we've shifted it slightly so that it's CAS policy as opposed to traditional authenticated macro security.
Right. But at least this way you can have different security policies for each one of your add-ins,
Yeah.
right, since they're in different application domains.
Yeah.
So that's a really great advantage as well. Yeah. So what about deployment? How are these add-ins deployed? You mentioned that they have to be installed on the application. There's some things that have to go in the registry.
Yes.
Is there anything I can do to ease deployment? Can I deploy my assemblies to a shared server? Do I have to put them on the client? How does that whole mechanism work?
Yeah, the default case without using the VSTO add-ins, so with traditional managed add-ins, you have an MSI, what you've got to end up with is some entries in the registry and the DLL somewhere on the machine. And that works, but it's quite simple. With our model, we support that, so you can build a setup project. We give you a setup project in Visual Studio. You can build that, you get an MSI, you run that. That will set up the registry entries, put the DLLs on the machine. But in addition, you can, if you want, as you say, you can deploy the assembly or the assemblies to a server. And that means that you've got a level of indirection, you've got a bit more flexibility about how you update things and how you maintain things. If you find that you've deployed an add-in across your enterprise and you've discovered that there's a problem with it, you can turn it off, because if you've deployed it to a server, you just turn off that server, and then all of that, everybody's add-ins are turned off. You have some choices, and we don't mandate what you do, so you could actually deploy everything locally on an MSI, on the setup project. That will set up the registry entries, it will deploy to the local machine. Alternatively, you could put the registry entries on the local machine, but put the add-in assembly on the server somewhere. We also have a manifest mechanism, which is the same as with VSTO document customizations, which is based on click-once manifests, although it's not quite the same. We use the same schema. The idea there is that when you install an add-in, you get entries in the registry, and the registry won't point to the add-in DLL. It will actually point to the path of the manifest. The manifest is just an XML config file. And in the manifest, you then point to wherever the DLL is, which may be on the local machine or it may be on a server somewhere. And that means you can actually update your deployment by updating the manifest. You don't have to keep retouching the registry, which gives you a bit more flexibility. Again, if you put it on a server and the server goes down, you need to redirect to another server, or you've decided that you want a new version of it that's in a different location on another server, then you just change the manifest. You don't have to change the registry, which makes things easy, because it's obviously easier to change a manifest than it is to mess about with people's registries. So you can deploy locally, you can deploy partly locally in terms of the registry and partly on a server. We also have an update mechanism so that there is a way that you can have your registry point to a manifest. The manifest can point to a deployment manifest, which can then point to an updated manifest. This is actually, it sounds confusing, but this is actually exactly the same as VSTO document customizations use. So it's a way that you can use to update your deployment automatically. As the thing gets loaded, it will check, the VSTO runtime will check for you whether there is a newer version.
It's that whole thing of additional level of indirection that you get through the combination of app manifest and deploy manifest.
Yeah. Yeah. It gives you more flexibility. It's scope that you didn't have with traditional add-ins. And we've had it with VSTO document customizations, and you didn't have it with add-ins, and now you've got it with add-ins as well, which gives you more flexibility about how you deploy.
And it's enabled by the runtime, by managed code.
That's right.
Manifest story's been around for a long time. Excellent.
Pretty cool. So is there anything that I know one of the things that I see sometimes with add-ins in Outlook is that, I close Outlook and it stays in memory because the Outlook process doesn't shut down. I know there's some, it's pretty difficult there to get all of the reference counting down so that the application will close. Is there anything that you've done in VSTO to help with that problem?
Yes, we have. The basic plumbing, as I said, the VSTO runtime is shared across document customizations and application add-ins. and it's not specific to a particular host. So we could use the same add-in loader for Word and Excel and PowerPoint and Access and Project and Visio front page. But for Outlook, we focused on Outlook because there are some problems with Outlook. One of which, as you say, is the shutdown problem. And
well, can we talk about the shutdown problem is because of the implementation of an add-in as opposed to a problem in Outlook, correct? So if I write an add-in in Outlook and don't clean up my references correctly, I'm the problem when Outlook tries to shut down because it's not. Can we talk about that? Like, because you said Outlook is a problem, and I'm thinking, well, why does Outlook have a problem shutting down?
Yes, if Outlook didn't support add-ins, there wouldn't be a problem.
Okay.
So, yeah, is it a problem in Outlook itself? Well, it is if you use add-ins, and it isn't if you don't. So you could argue that it's an add-in problem. It's not a problem specific to any particular add-in. It's a problem generally that if you have add-ins in Outlook, what happens is that you get into a deadlock situation because there's a method that gets called to tell the add-in to unload, the on-disconnection method in the IDT extensibility 2 interface.
Okay.
So add-in will, when Outlook wants to shut down, when the user clicks close and says I want to shut down Outlook, Outlook will go through its collection of add-ins and call the on-disconnection on each one. And that's an indication to the add-in to say, right, we're just about to go away, we've got to clean up our resources because we're about to be uploaded. The problem with Outlook is that if you have an add-in that is holding references to objects in the Outlook object model, like the explorers or the inspectors or mail items or pretty much anything, then Outlook doesn't call on disconnection. So it says, I'm not going to call on disconnection because there's something out there holding on to one of my objects and therefore I can't shut down. And the add-in says, well, I haven't been told to disconnect, so I'm going to keep on holding on to this thing. And so there's a permanent deadlock. Outlook will never shut down.
Understood. So I retract my earlier statement. It's an Outlook problem.
It's an Outlook problem.
So this doesn't happen in add-ins that I write for other applications, right?
No, right. This is an Outlook-specific problem. And it's obviously something that Outlook have been aware of for some time, and they are fixing. The problem is that Outlook is actually a very complex host compared to say, Word and Excel. It does a lot of very complicated things, talking to Exchange Server, for instance, supporting scenarios like ActiveSync. So there are a lot more variations on what Outlook does at the point where it wants to shut down. So it's actually very difficult to fix the shutdown problem.
Sure.
So in the add-in loader, we have a workaround. There is a standard workaround that people are aware of out in the field, and we've incorporated the basic model within our add-in loader, which basically tracks the number of inspectors and explorers that you have open, and every time a new one opens, we count them, and every time one closes, we count them as well. So we watch to see when there are no inspectors and explorers at all, at which point we assume, well, there are no windows, therefore Outlook must be shutting down. And that's when we know that, okay, it's time to unload. Now, this doesn't actually cover us in all situations. There's still a small percentage of automation scenarios with Outlook which we can't accommodate. And there's basically things like ActiveSync. ActiveSync typically automates Outlook, but it doesn't show any windows. So we can't use the count of the number of windows to work out whether Outlook's shutting down or not, because there may not be any windows ever.
So by automate, are you referring to using the object model from a different process,
Yeah.
external automation? I just wanted to clarify that. Sometimes people think, have different understandings of what automation means.
Yeah, sure. Well, that's what ActiveSync does. It automates Outlook, so it starts up an Outlook process, but it starts it up in a way that doesn't show any Outlook windows. So Outlook is actually running. But then what can happen is that the user can then go to their start menu and say, okay, I want to start Outlook, at which point it doesn't start a fresh copy of Outlook, it uses the existing running copy of Outlook, but starts showing windows. So then we're in the situation where, okay, now we can start tracking windows. But suppose all the windows go away because the user has closed Outlook. That doesn't mean to say that Outlook's gone away, because it can still be being automated by ActiveSync. So then we don't know. If we're an add-in, all the windows have gone, should we unload or not? And it depends. If we're the sort of add-in that relies on UI, then all the windows are gone, we can shut down. But if we don't care whether there's UI or not, then we might not want to shut down, we might want to keep on going. Right. So there is a small percentage of add-ins that just cannot be covered
Sure.
by our workaround.
But at least you can cover the 80-20
Yeah,
that's a large percentage of them. That's great. So you mentioned before that this technology could be equally applied to other host applications, you know, Word and Excel. So is that the plan? Is going forward, will the add-in model for those other applications be built on this model, or is it too early to say? Or
it's too early to say. Technically, there is no reason why we couldn't use exactly the same plumbing, the same VSTO runtime, and the same add-in loader. And we certainly tested this out, obviously, as part of our early planning to make sure that it would actually work in Access and PowerPoint and Visio and the rest of it, and it does. So technically, there's no reason why we wouldn't. The problems are that we would have to provide tool support. So at the moment, we have Visual Studio project types for Outlook specifically. We could have Visual Studio projects for Word and Access and PowerPoint and all the rest of it. It's the testing matrix really is the issue there. We would have to test all of those for all 9 of the Office hosts. And in permutations of, well, suppose you've got an Outlook add-in and Outlook is using Word as your email editor, and you've also got a Word add-in, and what are the issues there? As far as the runtime is concerned, there is no technical reason why we couldn't support all Office hosts. At design time, there's just work to get all that done.
but that's kind of a different approach than the current shared add-in project, right? You had a single project type, and then you select all of the add-ins. Do you foresee people wanting to write add-ins that target multiple host applications, or how would you do that in this model?
No, is the short answer. I mean, my experience out in the field before I came into Corp is that so the model with the shared add-in, the IDT Extensibility 2 shared add-in that you've had in Visual Studio for some time, the model is that, as you say, if you have a checklist of hosts that you want to support, you could say, well, this add-in runs in Word and Excel and PowerPoint. In practice, people almost never do that. Because the functionality that they want is specific to Excel. It's an Excel solution. It's not an Excel and maybe sometimes PowerPoint solution. Just the requirements for that just don't arise. So I'm sure there are people, a very small number of people who do that, but the vast majority of people don't do that. They target one host and one host only. So that's the model that we've adopted. And in doing so, it gives us another benefit. It means that we know in advance which host you're targeting. Because you say you want an Outlook add-in, or later on presumably you want an Excel add-in, or you want a PowerPoint add-in, so that we can generate code as part of the project that is specific to Outlook, and it will therefore give you IntelliSense and autocomplete. And we've got code that is aware of the way that command bars are set up in Outlook, for instance, as opposed to, well, we don't know if you're running in Outlook or in Excel, and command bars are set up slightly differently, so I'm not quite sure what we're going to do. We can strongly type things, so we give you an Outlook application object, whereas with the IDT Extensibility add-in, you get an object,
Right.
which you suspect is an Outlook object, and you kind of have to speculatively cast it to an Outlook object and keep your fingers crossed. And probably it is, but it might not be, because you might actually be running in Excel.
Right.
Whereas with ours, you know in advance you are going to be running an Outlook. This is an Outlook object.
That's an excellent, very important point.
Strong typing tends to be easier to work with.
Yes.
So is there anything else that we can expect to see in VSTO Outlook add-ins? Is there any design time support? Is there anything? Because I know that this is a V1 for the Outlook as an application.
Well, we have the basic runtime, which is the VSTO runtime. We have an add-in loader that bootstraps the VSTO runtime. That's host agnostic, so it will work with other hosts. For design time, at the moment, we only have design time support for Outlook. So we have Outlook add-in project with an Outlook add-in setup project as well. That's it. That's all we have. We don't have, just to be clear, we don't have anything else apart from the loader and the runtime. So we do the basic stuff of getting your thing loaded, getting your add-in loaded in a separate app domain with security restraints and configuration checking and so on. We don't, and we have a strongly typed Outlook application object that you can code against, but we don't wrap the Outlook object model in any way. So we don't have any kind of easier ways to have custom forms or easier ways to have new items in the navigation pane. Or we don't do things that are host specific in that sense. We have some samples and we have some code snippets that show you how to do these things, but we don't build that into our runtime because our runtime is a host agnostic runtime.
So it's similar to the model in VSTO 2003, where you had a project type, and then once you had all that code hooked up, basically your programming model involves going directly against the object model.
That's right. Yeah.
So anything you could do,
Yes.
you could do that. Well, that's good to know too. I mean, it's a V1, so I think
It's a V1, and also, as I say, it didn't seem to make sense to incorporate host-specific features down to that level within a runtime that's basically generic. And in theory, our runtime could be used, certainly can be used across all of Office, in theory across any other application you care to mention, not just Office. So if we start loading it down with things that are specific to specific Office hosts, that would kind of pollute the model somewhat. So we didn't do that. Also, we're aware that Office 12 is coming up fast, and there are changes in Office 12, particularly in Outlook, so we don't want to start wrapping stuff that we think is going to change. We just give you direct access to the PIAs, the primary interop assemblies. So whatever they are, if they're Office 11 PIAs or if they're Office 12 PIAs, you talk to those.
well, that's good. I think we'll look forward to working with that. Are you going to update your book at all to cover some of these new technologies?
No, but there is a new book coming out written by a couple of other members on the team, Eric Carter and Eric Lippert, and they're writing a book purely on VSTO 2005, which will cover Outlook editors.
Oh, that's
as
great.
well.
Very good to know. I'll definitely keep an eye out for that book.
Yeah, that sounds great. Looking forward to using it.
I don't know, Anita, where do you think people are going to, what do you think people are going to be doing with this? Do you foresee any specific scenarios that are more likely to be built using this?
Well, it's just an enabling technology. People have wanted to build add-ins for Office hosts for a long time, and people do build add-ins. And increasingly, people want to build managed add-ins because of the richness of the .NET framework, and because it's so much easier to develop them and make them robust and so on. So, but we've had a problem in that there's a mismatch between Office, which is non-managed, it's COM-based, and managed code, which is what people want to develop their add-ins in. Putting the two together gives you a problem if you don't shim it. Shimming is a problem because it's not supported and it's tricky to modify. So all we've done is smooth that path. So we know people already want to build managed add-ins, application level add-ins, and they'll continue to do that. But now they can do it in a way that's easy, it's robust, it's supported, and we've got design time support, and it's also consistent with their document customizations, and the same plumbing will work with other hosts, the rest of Office and beyond. So it's just an enabling a smoother path to stuff that people already want to do.
And you get to use Visual Studio,
That's
right? I can embed WinForms and
Yeah.
Outlook, and I can debug a running instance of my add-ins.
Yes.
Call web
Nice.
services.
Fantastic. This is going to be amazing, actually. It's going to be really fun to see what people build with this. Good job. And you said that's all, all you've done is the hardest part, which is make it possible.
So lay the foundation so
Great
that
job.
the next version we can expect to see all greater better tool support and stuff.
Yeah.
Oh, it's great.
Totally.
Thanks, Ed. That's great.
Yeah. Thanks for your time. Great to meet you. Looking forward to it. And it's coming out when? It's out today.
It was just announced today, so you'll expect to see this in Visual Studio Tools for Office version 2005.
All right. Cool. Thank you.